Like the bill we just passed in the last session, if we accept the rhetoric on the face of it, it's hard to argue against it. Monies from the present 2 cent a litre levy on petrol and diesel will now go to the Climate Action Fund if we pass this bill, and that fund, we are told, will be used to help reduce our emissions and reach our climate target. What can you not like about that? Except there are a number of questions that arise, and there's a fundamental weakness in the logic behind this kind of policy, and it becomes clear when you look at it closely. Anyone who reads about the history of this levy would be forgiven for thinking that the oil companies actually pay the levy, and indeed the association that represents the oil companies actually threatened to take legal action if the levy was used for climate action and put into a separate fund and not returned to them. Except they don't pay the levy. Motorists do, on every litre of petrol and diesel that they use. The oil companies simply collect it. So, like the general drift with carbon taxes, it's not the industry that pay, it's the people who often have no alternative but to use cars that use petrol and use diesel. So the €500 million fund, which the government have trumpeted for years as a key plank in its climate action, depends on the continued use of petrol and diesel to fund it. And to me, there's a degree of irony in that. And in fact, the recent COVID crisis probably highlighted it, insofar as the reduction in the sale of petrol and diesel would have meant, I assume, a reduction in the amount that would have gone to the fund. And I point this out to highlight the weakness in the policies that appear to be clever wizard ideas, but it seems to me that behind this sort of logic that these kind of funding streams propose, there really is an element of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. We are all aware of the IPCC report, of the dire time frame for the far-reaching and radical action in our transport, energy and our entire social system that we need to avoid catastrophic climate change. A wish that is increasingly impossible for many parts of the globe who are presently experiencing that catastrophic climate change. So these policies, in my view, do not suggest that we understand the scale and the pace of the change that is needed. And when you look at projects currently to be funded by the Climate Action Fund, you see another problem. So should the emphasis in policy be, for example, on charging points for electric vehicles or facilitating a massive boom in the sale of electric vehicles and the use of electric vehicles, as opposed to a revolution in public transport? And equally, I'm unsure that funding for so-called environmentally friendly gas projects is anything other than wishful thinking. The emphasis by Gas Networks in its project for climate action on biogas projects is not going to result in our targets being reached or the kind of radical and far-reaching policies that are needed on our climate. And again, there are logical problems with biogas, which relies on a supply of both animal manure and plant biomass. I want to quote from the acclaimed NGO Food and Water Watch on this issue in their recent publication. And I quote, "Despite claims of environmental benefits, biogas is primarily made up of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, and the focus on the supposedly renewable nature of biogas ignores the many environmental and health threats posed by a major source of this gas, manure from massive factory farms. Biogas has no place in the world's clean energy future." Lastly, I want to comment on the proposed changes to the biofuel obligation, and again to point out that on paper this seems like an eminently sensible policy, but in reality exposes weaknesses in the general overall approach. The obligation is meant to encourage the use of alternatives to fossil fuels in our energy use, and it seems it has. I know at the time of introduction it was hoped to have a boom in local indigenous production of various forms of biofuel. In fact, because of the logic of the market, it resulted in the closure of dozens of budding projects, as most of the biofuel ended up being imported from Holland. To quote one comment, "The biofuel obligation scheme has been the death knell of indigenous biofuel production in this country." Equally as with biogas, there are huge question marks over the sustainability of biofuel of all types. and whether it actually results in any savings in terms of CO2 emissions, if we look at the entire life cycle of the plants, etc., and how they're used and transported. One report found that plans to shift Europe's coal plants to burning wood pellets instead could accelerate rather than combat the climate crisis and lay waste to woodland equal to half the size of Germany's Black Forest every year. Another study says that it indicates that the sustainability of rapeseed biodiesel in the interpretation of the EU's renewable directive is at best questionable, and in most scenarios it is simply unjustifiable. So my overall point is that neither the Nora levy nor the Climate Action Fund, or looking into biogas or biofuels, are really addressing the need for the far-reaching and fundamental change that the climate crisis requires. And ultimately, I believe that tinkering around the edges will not result in global reductions in the emissions or tackle the causes of the crisis, which at its heart remains the hold of the fossil fuel industry on energy, on transport, and the need of our current economic system to continually grow and provide profits over the other concerns, whether that is about sustainability or the sustainability of the lives of people on the planet.